V1. Rotate.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another Flight Sim 008 video. And today we're going to be doing something a bit different. We're on the ground at Fly Tampa's wonderful rendition of Montreal Pierre-Elliott Trudeau International, or CYUL. And we'll be operating this flight to, well, Montreal Pierre-Elliott Trudeau International. Yes, we're doing laps in a 737. Now, unfortunately, every attempt I made to borrow one of Fly UK's 73s ended up with me ever so gently being tossed out the rear door, so I hopped on a transatlantic flight to Montreal, and as I was deboarding, I saw this airplane sitting here on the apron, and nobody seems to be using it. So, for confidentiality purposes, I won't say who it belongs to, but suffice it to say, it rhymes with best wet. Anyway, before we sneak into the flight deck, let's just have a quick look at the charts. Okay, so we're just going to focus on the airport overview chart today, because, well, though I'm familiar with this airport, I just wanted to go over our game plan. So Montreal has 3 runways to choose from. We've got a set of parallel 624s, and an intersecting and much shorter runway 1028. We're parked around here at hardstand Echo 2, and the plan is to taxi out here on to the north side of the apron, and then over to the holding bay of 06 right. We'll depart runway 6 right, climb out to about 5,000 feet, make a couple of left turns for a downwind leg, and then get set up for a couple of approaches on runway 06 left. There's a couple of reasons I chose 6 left for our approaches. One, it's the longest of the 3 runways at 11,000 feet, and also it's the only runway here at Montreal that is set up for a Cat 2 approach. Why does that matter? Well, you may have noticed that I haven't really talked about the winds or anything yet, and that's because today, thanks to Active Sky Next, I am the god of weather. So, welcome back to the flight deck of the 737NG. Now, I want to preface this video, like I do most of my other ones, with I'm not a real pilot. I do work in the aviation industry, and most of my knowledge, especially about the 737, comes from reading up, watching other YouTube videos, and generally being an aviation geek. Anyways, I didn't want this to be a tutorial video, I just kind of wanted to talk about some of the unique features of this aircraft, since we'll be spending a relatively good amount of time in it in our series Class E to ATP. Anyways, so the first thing I wanted to talk about was lighting. The 737 has four landing lights, 4 individual bulbs on the outside of the aircraft, 2 fixed, one on either side on the leading edge of the wings, and 2 underneath the aircraft that are retractable. Now, different airlines use different SOPs, or standard operating procedures, and they basically dictate when these lights should be on or off. The general rule that I like to use is that the fixed landing lights stay on under 10,000 feet. So under 10K, we turn on the fixed landing lights so that other aircraft can see us better, and we can kind of see a little bit more what's ahead of the aircraft. The retractable landing lights do produce a tiny amount of drag, and when you're flying up to 250 knots, which is the speed limit under 10K, they can be stressed by the winds and different air pushing around them. So we leave those off until we're on final approach, or when we're taking off. The general idea, the practice that I use, is that we leave the fixed landing lights on when we're coming in, and once we're clear to land, we turn all of the lights, including the retractable landing lights, on. When we're taking off, they come up and off as part of the cleanup procedure. Here's what it looks like on the outside of the aircraft. So we've got the fixed landing lights here on the wing, those don't move, and these are the retractable underneath the aircraft landing lights that we turn on when we're clear to land, so we're at a lower airspeed so that they don't get buffeted around and they're not producing drag when they don't need to be. And after we take off, we retract them and turn them off. So we always have visibility to other aircraft with the fixed landing lights, and we have the added visibility of the retractable landing lights. So let's go ahead and turn those off. You can see they retract back and flush with the aircraft. The taxi and runway turnoff lights, well, the runway turnoff lights are also situated just next to the fixed landing lights in the leading edge of the wings, and they kind of project forward but also outwards so that you can kind of see when you're landing the runway turnoffs on either side of the aircraft. They can also be used while taxiing to see the next turn that you need to be making, and just to give yourself a better situational awareness while on the ground, especially at night. The taxi light is situated on the nose gear of the aircraft and points directly forward, but then also turns in this particular aircraft, in the 737, turns with the nose gear so that you can see where the nose gear is pointed. Now let's talk a little bit about bleed air. Well, what is bleed air? Bleed air is high pressure, high temperature air that is extracted from one of several sources on the aircraft to power either cabin pressurization, de-icing systems, or to start the engines. Starting the engines, it's not too... If you want to think about it like starting a car engine, well, when you turn a key in a car, an electrical motor turns the engine over several times in order for it to start producing its own power and starting that cycle of actually being autonomous and running on its own. That's kind of what bleed air does to the engines. It pushes air into an engine until it's spinning fast enough where the pressure is great enough that we can introduce fuel and it can start to run on its own. Now there are three main sources of bleed air on the aircraft, one being each engine on either wing, and the third one being the APU. The APU, or Auxiliary Power Unit, is stored in the tail of the aircraft right around here, and this little valve opens up to feed cool air, ambient air, into the tiny little jet engine, and it basically gets pushed out at the rear of the aircraft. Just think of it as a cheaper way to get electrical power to the aircraft rather than running the engines all the time. So let's give the APU a start. First, we'll give it some fuel by turning on one of the fuel pumps, and then we'll flick on the start switch. Oh, I can see on this aircraft we have an inop APU, so essentially the APU is inoperative. It being a rather complex engine in the back of the aircraft, things can go wrong. So I guess we're going to have to find a different way to get our bleed air to start the engines today. Our 737 here isn't really in its natural habitat. Its natural habitat is up in the sky. When it's on the ground, it kind of needs all of these machines all over the place to kind of give it life support, to just keep most of the things running. One of those things is the air cart for passenger comfort, and that's basically just an air conditioning unit, and these pipes here are piping air conditioned, whether it's heated or cooled air, into the cabin to keep cabin circulation going. The other thing we can see on the ground here is our electrical power unit, and this is our ground power unit. So rather than having to run the APU the entire time, which costs fuel, this costs even less fuel, usually gas or diesel, and supplies the aircraft with electrical power through an outlet plug. What we're going to need to find is another source of bleed air to get these engines fired up, and that's where the air start unit comes in. Let's go ahead and connect that. You can see in front of us another cart has appeared, and this is basically a giant hairdryer. It's going to provide our bleed air, highly pressurized air, into the system that is already on board the aircraft to supply one of the engines with enough air to start it turning so that we can inject the fuel and it can become self-sustaining. Now that we've connected the air start unit, if we go up to the overhead panel, you can see that we have positive duct pressure. That basically just means that there is high pressure air in the system that we can use to do whatever we choose with it. So the packs are the air conditioning units in the aircraft. Their main purpose is to pressurize the cabin with comfortable, normal room temperature air. The isolation valve in the middle here basically isolates the left and the right side of the aircraft. So as I mentioned before, each engine is capable of providing bleed air to the system. By closing or opening the isolation valve, we can isolate the left or right hand sides of the aircraft. When we put in the ground air start unit cart, that normally supplies air to the right hand side of the system. So the engine number 2 system. If we were to start the APU, that generally supplies the left-hand side of the aircraft full of bleed air. By opening or closing the isolation valve, we can have it either isolate one side or the other, or have that air separated or shared between both sides. If I were to close the isolation valve, you can see that the left-hand side of the aircraft, this side, is now cut off from the right-hand side of the bleed air system, and the air cart is only providing bleed air to the right-hand side. If I were to reopen it, that bleed air is now being shared by both sides. Consequently, if we were running the APU without the ground start unit, we would see the left-hand side stay, and if I were to close the isolation valve, the right-hand side would lose pressure. So getting our first engine started on the air start unit is pretty similar to getting it started on the APU power, just a different source of bleed air. There are a couple of things we're going to do here first. One is bring up the engine page to monitor our systems as we start up. The second thing we're going to do is turn on our anti-collision light, and we'll make sure that the parking brake is set. We don't want the aircraft moving around once the engine starts. So looking over at our duct pressure, we have between 30 and 40 psi of duct pressure. Ideally, for starting the engines on the 737, it's between 30 and 40 psi. So let's turn off the packs and get a little bit more of that bleed air going towards the engine start. Now you can see it climbed up all the way to 40. So with that, all we have to do is turn our engine start switch to ground, and watch as that bleed air starts to rotate the inside blades and the outside blades of the engine. And that's a good start on engine number 2. So to get the other one fired up, we're going to do something a little bit different. We could use the air start unit on the ground, continue with the second startup as normal, and just taxi out of here. But we're going to do something a little bit different, and that's why we're parked here at the hard stand at Echo 2, so that we can just taxi out on one engine. So let's get the gen bus onto engine number 2. Now we're receiving electrical power from there. We can leave the packs off. We'll get our electrical hydraulic pumps on. We will get our pitot statics. And let's get ourselves off of all of the ground connections, like so. Now the aircraft is self-sufficient. We're basically on our own. By turning on the bleed air from engine number 2, we're going to start to see the duct pressure rise. The problem is, if you remember earlier, we need between 30 and 40 psi to start an engine, and we're only showing a little bit past 20. So how do we get more duct pressure? Well, by increasing the amount of pressure we can supply to the system, and we do that by increasing power to the engine. Now, looking behind the aircraft, there appears to be, well, some equipment and possibly some vehicles and maybe some ground crews working around there. So I don't want to chance it and start to increase power from here and blast all these guys while I try to start my second engine. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a right turn out of the parking and aim the jet blast in this direction so that we're not blasting anything sensitive. And we'll start to increase a little bit of the power on engine number 2. By the way, by pressing the E or Echo key on your keyboard, and then either pressing 1 or 2 on your keyboard, you can select which engine you'd like to basically manipulate. To get them both back, we would press the E key, and then 1 and 2, one after the other. So we're starting to roll here on one engine. Plenty of power just coming off of one engine to start going forward. And we're just going to make a right turn here onto the guideline. Like so. basically just turning out of the way of anything behind us. At this point, if we're going to do this, it would probably be a good idea to advise ATC, just so that they don't put anybody directly behind us and they can warn other pilots around us. And it's going to take a little bit of time as well, so before we start taxiing out, we would advise them that we're about to do this. So we'll just tap the brakes here, come to a stop on the guideline, and set the parking brake. So remember, we're looking for between 30 and 40 psi of pressure, just disable TrackIR, to get number engine 1 started. Currently we're showing about 20. So if I start bringing up the throttle on engine 2, you'll see the duct pressure start, well, actually it did rise to about 32. And that's plenty for us to start the other engine. All we have to do is select ground. Watch N2 rise, watch N1 rise, and at 25% hit the fuel. And that's a good start on both engines. Let's get the bus going. Now we have electrical power from both engines. You can see we brought the throttle back down to idle power once the second engine, once engine 1 was stabilized. So I just pressed the E and 1-2 key together on my keyboard. So in rapid succession 1 and 2, and that selects both engines. If I were to press E2, that'll give me engine number 2, and if I press E1, that'll give me engine number 1. So it's going to be a quick and dirty takeoff today. I'm not too fussed about anything in particular. We're just going to set the trim to roughly 4.91, get the flaps. I know the control surfaces are working because I didn't set up any failures. And let's get taxiing towards the runway. Runway threshold's right around over there. We're going to be departing 6 right, climbing up to about 5,000. I'll set that on the MCP. Again, not too fussed about procedure today. Make our left turns and start talking about other interesting things about this aircraft. A couple of other things I wanted to mention very briefly. Engine start switches. In the middle, they have a ignition selector. So basically, either engine has an igniter on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the engine. So it's not really selecting which engine we're going to start, much like in the Dash 8-400, but which of the igniters that we're going to use. General SOPs are you fly one leg on the left and then you fly one leg on the right. Certain conditions, Boeing suggests using both, such as heavy precipitation, that kind of thing. The last thing I wanted to talk about before takeoff was engine derates. So, in the ident page of the 737, basically when you start the FMCs, you get this page. You get the engine rating, so it's rated at 24,000 pounds of thrust, or 24K. Now when we take off, if the runway's long enough and we're light enough, we can derate those engines. two main reasons. One, why would we use more thrust when we don't need to? And second of all, by lowering the maximum output of the engines, we save on wear and tear and durability and maintenance. So today I've opted, because we're very, very light, to derate the engines to 20,000 pounds of thrust and add an outside temperature to trick the aircraft into thinking that we're lighter than we are, essentially. It's kind of backwards, but there's some math and magic that goes on beyond it. Basically, the higher the outside temperature that you put in there, you can derate the engines even more. So now we have a derated thrust of 84% N1. And you'll see when the engines spool up, they'll spool up to only 84% N1. Let's get ourselves lined up here on the runway. Remember, the toga switch is that little black button right in the middle there. I can't reach it with the mouse, so I have one mapped to my joystick. There's 40%. Stable. Toga. Toga standing, by the way, for takeoff, go around power. So, thrust is now set. You can see 84% N1. Try to keep it in the center here. There's 80 knots.
V1. Rotate. V2.
Gently ease it back. And there we have it. So, climbing out of Montreal, passing 1400 for 5. Start backing back to the left a little bit. Do a little bit of up trim. There we go. Bug up altitude will be coming up at give or take 3,000. You can get the retractable landing lights and the turn-offs on the taxi light. Switch these off. Switch that off. Auto brake can go off. Just spanking a little bit. I am flying this manually, by the way. Here comes 4. Start to pitch it over. We want 5. Start bugging up the speed. Put 200 knots for now. Engines throttling back. Flaps up. And there's our departure. A little bit of cloud, but not enough cloud for what I want to do a little bit later. I'm going to start our first left-hand turn to the crosswind leg, about 90 degrees-ish. Heading select. Bug it up to 220. Nice Montreal evening. Going to annoy the residents with some noise. This, by the way, is the Montreal VOR. It's north of the field, so I've just put it in there. It's 13 nautical miles north of the field, so we're just going to kind of aim for that. Make another left turn to the downwind leg, and then 2 more lefts for the inbound. So let's talk about our approach. We are going to go to departure and arrival. Arrival, 06 left. That's all I want. I don't want any stars in there or anything cluttering it up. I basically just want a straight through for the approach. So we have Zolta, and then Burpo, and then the field. So we're going to make another left, downwind, 2 more lefts, and come in for our final approach. We already have our inbound course set up on both sides. The nav radio 1 is already tuned to the ILS frequency. So basically I'm getting DME but from the field. And the nav radio 2 is tuned to the YUL or Montreal VOR, so I'm getting DME from that. Basically just for situational awareness. So let's talk again about the HGS. All we have to do is put in the elevation of the field. Again, in FSX, everything is completely flat, so we don't have to worry about undulating runways. And the length, 11,000 feet, like so. And this time, we'll see what happens once we've put all of that in. Alright, we're coming up to be far enough now from the field. What I'm going to do is select nav 2 to our ILS frequency. We've already got the course in. And you can see the standby has gone to IMC A3. That's exactly what we want. And I'll explain that in a little bit once we get closer to the field. So, remember earlier when I said I was the god of weather? Well, you'll soon find out why. Or at least why I said it. Bug down to 3,000 feet. We'll do a nice gentle descent here, and we'll bring our heading back towards base leg. What a pretty evening. Soon, not so much. So we're still doing 220 knots, which is fine for now. We'll start reducing that in just a bit. Still quite far away from the field. Coming down nice and gently, 250 feet per minute. There is the Fleuve Saint-Laurent. So, looking like a standard approach. Remember earlier when I said I am the god of weather? Well, you're about to find out why. Mwahaha. So, IMC conditions essentially can't see anything. I will turn on the HGS, and we will use that to fly the airplane. Quick look at the charts from an outdated cap. The ILS approach runway 6 left, Cat 2. The runway elevation is, the airfield elevation is 118. Touchdown zone elevation is 98, but that's just because the real runway undulates, and this one does not. What else? Localizer is 109.3. Zolta is about 12.9 DME from the field, and Burpo is 3.5. Important information, glide path is 3 degrees. The inbound course is 058. We're going to start off at 3,000. Make our way down, and our minimums for Cat 2 is 100 radio. So the radio altimeter comes alive, bounces radio waves off the ground constantly to give you a height above the ground, and 100 feet above the ground is our minimums. But you can see most of my pertinent information is all here. I've got my altitude on the right-hand side, I've got my speed on the left, and I've got the diamonds for the glide slope. I'm just waiting for... There we go, we can start our descent now. Bring the speed back, 180, bring up flaps 1. Now I'm way right of the localizer, but we're on the glide. Bring our speed back a little bit more. There's flap 1 speed. Focus alive. Gears coming out. Checked. Going back on the horizontal path. A little bit low. Feel our low capture. That's 15. There we go. No A3 because I have manual control. That makes sense. So there's that that line here. This dotted line represents a 3-degree glide. Now I'm below the glide slope, which is why I'm holding steady above it. And essentially, we want to keep, there we go, the vertical lines lined up as well. Still a little bit below the glide, so pitch up a little bit. Engines will spool up, take care of the rest.
1,000.
Checked. Remember, I can't see anything. Using the HGS. Everything's lined up. Scooch a little bit to the left. Back on the glide so I can try to pitch for that 3-degree there. Now I'm a little bit high. Pitch down a little bit. It's reminding me that there's no A3 auto land. I am fully aware. A little bit high. And there we see we have the runway outlined.
Plus 100.
Checked. Aim for the touchdown. Minimums landing.
50. 30.
Auto throttle's
20.
out.
10.
And that's how we land in IMC. Once again, I am the god of weather. Let's clear that up, and taxi back to the stand, and shut him down. Quick note, when about to cross a runway, most SOPs require strobe lights on. You can also put some of the landing lights on just to make sure that we're extremely visible. Last few little things I wanted to talk about here back on the stand. One, you'll notice I didn't restart the APU once back on the ground. That is because I didn't need to. Go ahead and shut down engine number 1, and we'll go straight to ground power. Save ourselves that much fuel. So ground power is now connected. That's all we really need. Over on the overhead, connect the ground power, get rid of the buses on the engines. We can straight ahead shut down number 2. The last thing I wanted to talk about very briefly was autopilot disconnect, because I've seen a lot of people use the disengage bar right here. And that basically, from my understanding, again, not a real pilot, not a real technician on a 737, but from my understanding, this is a physical disconnect between the flight computers and the control surfaces and other systems of the aircraft. Therefore, it is to be used in emergency cases only. The autopilot is behaving erratically, it's not reliable, something like that. That is what the disengage bar is for. That's why a lot of people, when they got the 777, they said, well, the siren can't be shut up on approach because it just keeps going off and off and off. If you use the disengage bar on the 777, yes, the siren cannot be silenced. But if you use this little button here, called Autopilot Disengage, once the siren goes off, everything is disconnected. Second time, siren turns off, and the aircraft is fully yours. And as for the auto throttle, if you look at the little arrows, AT disengage, AT disengage, there are two little buttons, one on each side here, and the pilot who's gripping this with their hand would use their, presumably, thumb and pinky to depress those little buttons on the side and take manual control of the throttles. By the way, toga power, one button there, one button right there. That's the toga power. So that's how we disconnect the autopilot in the 737. The auto throttle arm button here essentially, or the switch rather, goes into the off position once you hit these two little auto throttle disengages. I have those mapped to my Saitek throttle HOTAS system essentially, so that's not a problem for me. This is one of those things that I don't know. I don't know if it is okay procedure to just disarm the auto throttle. Maybe you can let everybody know in the comments. That would really help me out. I always just use whatever I have mapped for these two buttons. So that brings us to the end of my little video here. Again, not a tutorial. It was a dirty takeoff. I didn't really follow any procedures. It was you know, rough around the edges, the flight. But it was just basically showcasing some of the interesting features of this aircraft, since we're going to be spending a little bit more time in it now that our career is really getting underway. So I'm going to, while the parking brake is already set, we can release that in a second. We can get everything back plugged in and secured here for the nice people at the company who this aircraft belongs to, which shall still remain nameless. We will put it in a condition that we found it in. Oh, and by the way, in one of my videos I mentioned getting this thing out of the way and saying it was an air conditioner. It is actually not. It is the projector for the HGS system, the heads-up guidance system. So thank you to Emilio Anselmo. Sorry about butchering your name, but much appreciated in the comments for that little tip. So that is what that is. So it projects the image onto the HGS. So yeah. Again, not a tutorial. I'm sure there were some inaccuracies in there. This is how I fly the 737. This is what I've come to know from the 737. So just imparting a little bit of knowledge on my end. If you have any corrections you'd like me to consider, or essentially like everybody else to know that I did wrong and now I'm broadcasting wrong information, please feel free to put them in the comments, you know, and everybody else can upvote them. Hopefully they'll get some recognition. But in the meantime, I appreciate you joining me on this stolen flight here, and yeah, let's get deboarded. So hopefully nobody notices that the aircraft is not at the same parking that they left it, and it's missing an afternoon joyride's worth of fuel. But hopefully it was worth it for us, and we got a few little tidbits of knowledge, or at the very least some practice. Once again, thank you for joining me, and as always, I wish you blue skies, tailwinds, and I'll see you in the next episode.